What would happen if a simple filming day revealed Ferrari's biggest technical secret in years? What if that discovery came from the hand of Lewis Hamilton, aboard a car that had not yet convinced? What happened in Mugello not only took Maranello by surprise, it could change the season completely. Ferrari arrived with a simple agenda: to validate on the ground the redesign of its rear suspension system, a piece that had been conceived to reduce the aerodynamic rebound that complicated the tuning of the SF-25 from the preseason tests. As the regulation dictates, the team was allowed to travel 200 kilometers, using exclusively Pirelli demonstration tires, much harder and with less adhesion than those of competition. That should have limited any possibility of deep analysis. In fact, most teams use this type of days for purely media or logistics purposes, without expecting great technical discoveries. However, Ferrari decided to divide the mileage between his two pilots. First, Charles Leclerc's track, performing constant installation and filming. His work was meticulous, focused on collecting reference data. But when it was Lewis Hamilton's turn, everything changed. From the first round, the sensors began to show strange patterns, vertical load behaviors that were not aligned with the digital models used by engineers. The first suspicions aimed at a possible calibration failure. But as Hamilton completed more turns, the pattern was repeated, and did it with a consistency impossible to ignore. Hamilton was not simply rolling for the camera. Each of its trajectories, each braking and each power application was generating a different aeromechanical profile, one that the SF-25 had not shown throughout the calendar until that moment. Instead of the typical oscillations in the suspension that generated rebound and loss of traction, the car seemed to adhere to the track as never before. In sectors such as the second part of Mugello, where the lateral load is critical and any defect in the chassis is amplified, the car seemed to enter a perfect harmonic frequency with the layout. From the box's walls, the engineers watched in real time how the behavior of the car changing without an external physical modification. It was simply Hamilton understanding and exploiting a system that was still in beta. The internal discussions began immediately. How was it possible that this level of stability was achieved in such restricted conditions and with such a little representative tire compound? And why hadn't this behavior seen in any previous career drill? What was a low-profile event became a high-impact technical discovery. The internal radios were flooded with urgent communications, and from Maranello, Fred Vasseur was immediately connected to follow the live data. That day in Mugello, a pilot with 7 titles in the world managed to have an experimental piece work beyond its design. Instead of limiting himself to fulfilling the program, Hamilton offered Ferrari an unprecedented vision of the true hidden potential of his SF-25. That day that began as a simple recording session for promotional purposes became, without anyone knowing at the beginning, a technical and emotional turning point for the entire season. And the most ironic of all is that this moment did not arrive on a podium or in a pole position. He arrived in silence on an empty track, when no one was looking at, except the data. Formula One engineers are trained to distrust the unexpected. Any anomaly in the data is usually first attributed to an error in the sensors, a poorly calibrated reading, or even external interference. But the numbers that SF-25 telemetry threw during Hamilton's turns in Mugello simply could not be ruled out. Not because they were rare, but because they were perfect. One of the first parameters that caught the attention was the minimum curve speed. In sections such as Arrabbiata 2, a very high-speed curve where the aerodynamic limits of the car are tested, Hamilton maintained a speed between 6 and 7 km per hour higher than the best marked mark previously recorded by Leclerc or the simulation data. At first glance, this might seem a minor detail. But in a sport where thousands decide championships, a margin of 7 km per hour in a fast curve is a quantum leap in performance. Moreover, if it is achieved without penalizing general stability or compromising compounds. The most disconcerting was that this performance did not imply a mechanical sacrifice. There was no overriding in the chassis. No greater degradation of the soil table was detected. The flat background, which normally suffers excessive wear when the car behaves too aggressively with the asphalt. The SF-25 seemed more attached to the ground, but without the usual punishment in high compression areas. This was unpublished. Then came the second finding, the most revealing for Maranello technicians: the rear axle height variation. Usually, 2025 cars show a vertical fluctuation of between 3.5 to 5 millimeters due to the so-called porpoising, that aerodynamic rebound effect that is still present but much more controlled from the regulatory changes of 2023. In the case of Hamilton, that oscillation was reduced to only 1.4 millimeters. It was a completely out-of-range behavior. The first reaction was to order a complete review of the measurement hardware. Was the sensor failed? Had he was misaligned during the installation? Nothing. Everything was in order. The accuracy of the data was as clear as disturbing. The SF-25 was behaving like never before, and did it in very limited conditions without real race compounds or extreme adjustments. But the discoveries did not end there. The temperature analysis in the rear brakes showed another unequivocal sign that something extraordinary was happening. The thermal delta, which represents the maximum and minimal temperature difference in the brake system, remained within a margin of 12 degrees Celsius. For a car in tests with demonstration tires and without attack configuration, that figure is almost impossible to reach. It meant that the thermal balance of the car was perfectly distributed. The car stopped strongly, stable, and left the curves without losing traction. All with almost unnatural mechanical softness for what was expected of SF-25. Behind these data was a single key modification: the geometry of the new rear suspension system. The redesign of the upper kneecap, in combination with a modified suspension arm to improve the dynamic absorption of the axis, was working at a level that neither the most optimistic designers in Maranello had projected. Ferrari had been theorizing with this modification for months, but he had never tried it in real conditions with the freedom that Mugello offered. And when he did, it was Lewis Hamilton who revealed his true reach. The reactions inside Ferrari were immediate but not noisy. There were no celebrations or screams of euphoria. What reigned was silence. A silence that is born from the technical surprise of that moment in which a Formula One team understands that something has changed, that the car that they had been developing all year, perhaps without understanding it at all, hit a potential that was outside their own simulations. For Fred Vasseur, who followed the data from the headquarters in Maranello, it was like receiving one signal from another dimension. A car that until now had been inconsistent, delicate, and demanding to the limit, began to behave as a solid, coherent, and above all, competitive block. The team director soon convened an extraordinary technical meeting with the departments of simulation, aerodynamics, suspension, and dynamics of vehicles. But this time, the tone was not correction or adjustment. It was rediscovery. Ferrari, as a structure, needed to understand why the SF-25 was paying better in an informal environment with Hamilton at the wheel than in any weekend of Grand Prix, where every detail is planned until the last millimeter. Was there a failure in the interpretation of the previous data? Or had the potential of the car not explode due to lack of confidence in their technical direction? Loic Serra, the newly integrated technical director, assumed the leadership of the analysis. It was not a simple data review, but a kind of autopsy to a car that, ironically, was still alive and evolving. What was discovered was disturbing. Ferrari had been conservatively interpreting the mechanical limits of SF-25. In other words, they had been piloting with fear, restricting the freedom of the car through rigid setups that, in theory, offered stability, but that in practice they sacrificed dynamic performance. Hamilton had shown that, if he was given freedom to adapt the car to his style, he responded more than. This implied a restructuring of the set-up approach, work with simulators and prediction parameters. What follows for Ferrari is not just a technical adaptation. It is a complete reinterpretation of his car, pushed by an unexpected experience, revealed in the most Italian place of all, Mugello, and executed by a British pilot who, in just a few laps, reminded the team which really means having a competitive car between hands. Mugello was not a simple test. It was a revelation. One of those rarely when motorsport shows its most unpredictable side and, at the same time, more pure. For years, Ferrari has been the victim of his own expectations. Of the internal pressures, of the emotional burden of being La Scuderia, of the weight of decades of history that often acts more as an anchor than as impulse. But that day in Tuscany, something changed. And it was not another improvement in the long list of technical evolutions that each team introduces throughout the year. It was an epiphany. Hamilton, just a few laps behind the wheel, not only drove the car. He interpreted it. He forced him to speak a language that engineers had not yet learned to translate. Its driving style, its ability to feel the track and modulate the limit, allowed to unlock a hidden mode of the SF-25. A way that neither the simulators, nor the previous data, not even the wind tunnel had anticipated. And that discovery is not measured only in telemetry. It is measured in confidence. It is measured in the expression of the engineers who, after months of frustrations, saw for the first time they were not as far as they believed. Maybe they just needed to look at the car from another angle. Now the real challenge begins for Ferrari. Replicate that performance in a competitive environment. Translating what happened in Mugello to the weekends of Grand Prix, where the margin of error is void and each team is looking for exactly the same. That 10th hidden, that perfect balance, that moment of technical lucidity that changes everything. There are no guarantees, only possibilities. But Mugello made it clear that when conditions are aligned, this Ferrari is more than a promise. It is a real threat. And Lewis Hamilton, far from being a symbol of the past, could be the most anticipated resurgence architect in the recent history of the most legendary team of Formula One.